policies that protect pollinators. And then our final presentation will be from Greg Seitz, who is an independent writer and manages the St. Croix 360 website. So without further ado, I'm going to open up my presentation and start with the planting for clean water portion of today's workshop. And while I'm talking, if everybody could try to just go ahead and keep your mics muted, and if we have time for questions during the presentations, towards the end, you can turn your mic on. But in the meantime, try to use that written chat feature to type questions just so we cut down on the background noise. So Planting for Wildlife and Clean Water, this is an adapted version of a presentation that we have given to the public throughout the spring. We've had really tremendous participation in our spring workshops. When we converted them to webinars, we worried that maybe we wouldn't see as many people as we have in years past, and we honestly have had about 3 times as high of participation as we did in years past. So it's turned out to be a really great way to connect with the public. A lot of you are decision makers, and so this is kind of an overview of what we've been sharing with the public. So, both so that you have an idea of how we are talking about these issues with the public, and just so you have that background information for yourself as well. So I will be recording this, and we'll send out a link afterwards. Don't stress out if you don't have time to write down all of the information as it is being shared, because you can go back and look at the presentation later. Talking about Planting for Wildlife and Clean Water, I mentioned that I work at the Washington Conservation District. We're a local unit of government that's been around since 1942. And our primary role is education and technical services. And the EMWREP program also works hand in hand with the watershed management organizations in Washington County. There's 8, which you could see the areas that they cover. There's also 15 cities and townships that are part of the education program, and Washington County is a strong supporter as well. So when we're talking about landscaping for wildlife and clean water, we operate on somewhat of a continuum. So if you look on the upper left-hand corner, there's the far edge of the continuum. If you live in a giant mansion, this is my house, by the way, you have nothing but, a large lawn. There's virtually no habitat whatsoever. That's one starting spot. Kind of a next step in the right direction is perhaps maintaining the visual look of a lawn, but incorporating something like a bee lawn that has flowering species and provides nectar for pollinators. There are larger projects that we often work with homeowners on, things like Raingardens, shoreline restoration projects, large-scale native plantings, where we're really trying to create a big chunk of habitat and do something that helps to reduce runoff and improve water quality as well. And then there are some very large landowners in our area that we work with and are able to do large scale habitat restoration projects as well. So that's always something exciting when we're able to, really make a big difference on a project like that. So there's a lot of overlap between projects that are good for habitat and projects that are good for water quality. And a lot of times people will come to our workshops because they have a specific interest. They might be interested in fish or interested in birds, but we know that the projects that we work with them on will also have those additional benefits. So for example, this kind of messy looking shoreline has a lot of benefits for water quality because it reduces erosion, and it helps to helps to minimize the wave impact. It helps to filter out some of the nutrients that might be flowing off from the upland areas. And it creates a lot of really great habitat in the process. This is where we get to be slightly interactive. So I'm gonna go through some of the different kinds of wildlife that live in our area, starting with birds. There are 320 species of birds that use the St. Croix Valley as a home, either as a migratory corridor. One moment, I'm trying to pull up my chat thing. Migratory corridor or their year-round residents. And 60 of them are species of greatest conservation needs. So the interactive portion is where you get to try to guess what species you are looking at right now, what kind of bird it is. And the what I am trying to do is there we go, loggerhead shrike. I was trying to open my chat feature. For some reason, I can't see the chat box at the moment to be able to see answers that people are sharing. So how about if you know what the answer is, turn on your mic real quick and yell it out before I share what the actual name is. Anybody got to guess what this bird is?
Loggerhead shrike. Red-headed woodpecker.
Oh, red-headed woodpecker, yes. Oh, and I can finally see the chat again. Okay, great. I can see the chat again. You guys can use the chat now. I don't know why my chat was missing. Okay, that was red-headed woodpecker. All right, what's this one? Any guesses?
It's red-shouldered hawk.
Red-shouldered hawk. Excellent. Y'all are good at this. Okay, what about this one?
Ovenbird?
Wood thrush.
Wood thrush.
Wood thrush. Okay.
Wood thrush. Okay. So I'm not going to quiz you the entire time, but those are just a few of those species of greatest conservation need that live in our area. One of the cornerstone books that a lot of us talk about is Bringing Nature Home by Doug Tallamy. And he did a lot of research on native plants, the insects that they support, and then the fact that those insects are in turn food for birds. And so a lot of us, when we think about habitat for wildlife, we think about, well, having a shrub that might have berries that a bird would eat, but it's often more important to have a shrub that attracts lots of insects, and then the birds are more often eating the insects during the summertime. A few of those kinds of trees and shrubs that are really good for birds: wild plum, red osier dogwood, black cherry, white oak. I think white oak, based on his research, attracts 519 species of larval insects, which sounds absurd, kind of gross if you think about it in depth, but helps to explain why these are such a cornerstone species for wildlife, and particularly in oak savanna areas. So pollinators is something that Laurie's going to talk about in depth, but just to highlight some of the pollinators of concern, we're obviously very concerned about monarch populations, which have been declining over the past couple of decades. We've seen decreases of 53% just from 2019 to 2020. We do know that the monarch butterflies need to have milkweed in order to lay their eggs. And so there's a big push to plant more milkweed on our landscape, but they do also need nectaring species. So when they're adults, they will land on a whole variety of different kinds of plants in order to find food for the adult monarchs. There's a couple of different organizations that do a lot of work specifically focused on monarchs: the Monarch Joint Venture and Fish and Wildlife Service Save the Monarch Coalition campaign. The Rusty Patch Bumblebee is another one you've probably heard a lot about in the news lately. It's our newly designated state bee. It's a federally listed endangered species. And there's been an entire grant program, the Lawns to Legume program, that was created in Minnesota specifically to try to increase habitat for the Rusty Patch Bumblebee. One of the things about the Rusty Patch Bumblebee is that they nest in the ground. So it's not enough just to have nectar species for them. They also need to have loose soil or leaf litter along the ground near a woodland edge where they are able to overwinter and have nests. A few of the plants that we're recommending that people, sorry about the dog, Few of the plants that we're recommending that people plant for the rusty patch bumblebee. Molly, stop. And one of the things that's really important for this species in particular is to have a year-round supply of nectar. So it's not enough to have a good nectar flower for them during the summer. There has to be something in the spring, the early summer, the late summer, the fall. And important to remember too that the rusty patch bumblebee isn't the only kind of bee that lives in Minnesota. We have 3,600 known US bee species, and there's a couple hundred species that live here in Minnesota. So a lot of native bees. Just a few organizations locally that are working on research and advocacy around bees. And like I said, Laurie's gonna talk about Pollinator Friendly Alliance as soon as I get done. Turtles and frogs. This one is perhaps the most obvious connection with water quality because amphibians in particular, they have porous skin. And so anytime we have poor water quality, we have chemicals in the water, that is gonna affect them very directly. We're encouraging people to leave unmowed buffers near soggy woods and seasonal wetlands, and to leave fallen trees and logs in the water to provide places for turtles and frogs to bask. We do have a threatened turtle species, the Blandings turtle, that is prevalent in northern Washington County in particular. This one I took a photo of right off of the Gateway Trail up in the Browns Creek watershed. And they're unique in that they need a really large area of intact wetlands, lakes, and upland areas in order to be able to lay their eggs and breed. So a lot of them get killed by cars in the course of migrating to go lay their eggs during the early summertime. In 2013, I believe it was, Washington County and Washington County Parks worked with the Washington Conservation District, Carnegie Marine St. Croix Watershed District to create a turtle tunnel up by Big Marine Regional Park. This has been one of these highlight projects that the public absolutely loves. We have a motion detector camera that takes pictures of the wildlife that come through that tunnel. And you can see it's not just turtles, it's weasels, it's opossums, it's all sorts of wildlife coming through. And people just love seeing these photos. When we share them on Facebook, they go bonkers. It's, you know, the thing that probably gets shared more than any other kind of post that we use on social media. In terms of gardening with native plants, like I said, there's a lot of overlap between what's good for habitat and what's good for water quality. So native prairie plants, for example, have really, really deep root systems. You may have seen this before, Kentucky bluegrass, it's got roots that are maybe 2 inches deep. Some of these native prairie plants have roots that are 12 feet deep. So they're very good for stabilizing steep hillsides, for stabilizing shoreline areas. They are fire resistant, they're drought resistant, so they don't need as much water as well. And they can usually tolerate being inundated during a rainy season as well. Some of the plant species, and I'm going through these relatively fast just to be respectful of Laurie and Greg's time, but some of the native species that grow in different habitats, these are ones for shady to partial shade areas, partial sun to partial shade, full sun. This is really like the world's your oyster if you've got a full sun area. A few more full sun plants. And just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the adapted uses of native gardens and wildlife friendly gardens. I think by now everybody knows what a rain garden is, but just to play the wonderful, wonderful animation that's existed now for probably 15 years, a rain garden is basically a strategically planted garden. You put it somewhere where it's going to collect runoff from a road, a parking lot, a rooftop, and it's just ever so slightly concave so that the water, when it rains, will go in, it will soak into the ground or be taken up by the plants, evaporate instead of running off and carrying pollutants to a lake or stream. We spend a lot of effort working with shoreline landowners and encouraging people, especially if they have nothing but lawn down to the water's edge or rock riprap, to consider native plantings as an alternative that is a good way to stabilize the shoreline and really improve habitat in the process. We use this image from Minnesota DNR a lot to show, in a perfect world, this is what shoreline properties would look like. There would be lawn closer to the house, and then, you know, just a skinny walkway to be able to get down to the lake so that most of the shoreline natural habitat can remain intact. One last area that I wanted to talk about is the wetlands, since we have a lot of these in our area. Approximately 43% of threatened and endangered plant and animal species in the US live in wetlands. So this is really connected very directly to wildlife, also to water quality. A lot of times people refer to wetlands as our kidneys. They're protected by the Minnesota Wetland Conservation Act, protected by federal laws. Not all wetlands hold water throughout the year, and even if they're seasonal, they're still protected. And some cities and watershed districts do have unmowed buffer requirements that people are not allowed to mow or build up to the edge of a wetland. So in general, we recommend that people contact their soil and water conservation district with any questions related to projects they may be working on that would affect wetlands. A lot of times people will call us and ask, can I get rid of the weeds in a wetland? You know, and the main question is, first of all, is it actually a weed? Is it a native plant? And if it is an invasive species like a reed canary grass, purple loosestrife phragmites, these are 3 we're dealing with. You know, are there any permits or requirements that they need to have before they'd be able to work on removing those? So always research local regulations and check with the city, township, SWCD ahead of time. Just to share a few native wetland grasses and rushes, wetland forbs, and wetland shrubs that people can consider planting on their properties. And last one, this is one where you can guess. This is one of, it's almost an infamous one in our area, Hardwood Creek. And this is a wetland complex. A lot of times the wetlands are on the edges of streams and lakes. I just thought this one was particularly beautiful, so wanted to share it. In terms of resources for residents, people who are in Washington County can sign up for a free site visit from the Washington Conservation District, and we connect people directly with cost share grants available through their watershed districts. Outside of Washington County, the SWCD in your area is a good resource. In Wisconsin, the Land and Water Conservation Department is usually the first place to go. Many watershed districts have cost share grants for projects, especially like rain gardens and shoreline plantings. And then the Blue Thumb website is a great place to find plants and local contractors. And just ideas of some of the ones that are in our area that are currently open, are selling. Dragonfly Gardens, Landscape Alternatives, Kinnickinnick Natives, Lupin Gardens, Outback Nursery, Native Sun Seeds and Plants. These ones, I've checked with all of them. They're all working right now. Okay, so in the interest of time and politeness, I know that that was fast, but I'm going to turn things over to Laurie and let Laurie talk a little bit more in depth about pollinators. And if there's a wildlife question that didn't get answered, in the meantime, just put it in the chat and we can try to stick around at the end of the hour to answer some of those questions.
Okay, wow, great. Thank you, Angie. Hi, everybody. There's some repeat visitors there. Thanks for sitting in with me today. And Angie, thanks for sharing pollinator conservation with folks. It's so important for us all to support each other's work for wildlife, water, and land, because if we're going to save this beautiful world we live in, we need to all work together. So my job is to cover policies to protect pollinators in 20 minutes. So here we go. We're with Pollinator Friendly Alliance. PFA was born around a kitchen table in Stillwater, Minnesota, and has grown into a regional and statewide conservation and advocacy nonprofit. So never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. I know you're all muted, but take a guess anyway. How many caterpillars do you think a warbler might feed her clutch in one day? 3? 30? Well, 300 is the good guess. 300 caterpillars for one little clutch of birds. So remember, everything in the natural world is connected, and an ecosystem is a community of living things that work together and rely upon the other. So the caterpillars on the tree, the caterpillars for the bird, the water feeds the tree. So while we are planting habitat for pollinators, other wildlife and ecological benefits come along with that. I'll cover 3 main topics today: pollinator decline, pollinator conservation initiatives to save the pollinators, and using partnerships and policies for conservation. In Minnesota, there are approximately 460 species of wild bees, like bumble and digger bees. We know there are 150 species of butterflies and skippers, and there's thousands of moth species. 8 state-listed endangered species, including the rusty patch and the Dakota skipper, and there are 30 other known at-risk species. We had a good handle on butterflies already. We're just now counting bees, so that bee number changes over time. And moths really are unknown, but there are many of them. So the top causes of pollinator decline include pesticide use, habitat loss caused by pesticide use, industrial agricultural practices, and fragmentation of landscapes due to development, and then climate change. Reducing pesticides is on the top of our list. Remember that combining pesticides together, plus the additives and inert ingredients, intensify the toxicity. In an in-process field study at the University of Minnesota right now, we're looking at pesticides on flowering native habitat nearby potato crops. And we found a minimum of 2 and up to 15 pesticides on each plant and every plant. Unfortunately, milkweed collected more pesticides than the other plants, probably because of the large fuzzy leaves. So as development and overpopulation fill up our natural landscapes, wildlife and pollinators are showing up in urban and suburban areas. So backyard habitats and creating corridors through suburban and urban areas of habitat are more important than ever. So with climate change, all species have responded to those climate changes throughout their evolutionary history. But of concern is the recent rapid rate of change where species show differential movements. So rather than shifting together as before, for example, glacier lilies in Colorado now bloom days earlier than a couple of decades ago. So the flowers bloom before the bumblebee queens can emerge in the spring. So the flowers don't get pollinated, and the bloom mismatch leaves the hungry bumblebees without their flower foods. So what are we doing to help pollinators? This is the sort of the policy part. Oops. In Minnesota, there's a network of pollinator advocates comprised of many organizations and individuals, citizen-based and government. The primary initiatives include increasing habitat, incentives for farmers to transition away from pesticides, legislation right now going through the legislature. The Senate will be in session again this month. Includes putting tags on bags of seeds that are treated with neonicotinoids. So right now a farmer can buy a bag of seed and they won't know whether it's been treated or not based on the bag. Replacing turf with habitat is another initiative. And legislation also going through currently is reducing, or actually a ban on neonicotinoids in wildlife management areas. And then the final legislation is preemption for local communities, which would allow them to regulate their own pesticide use on public government land, city land, and of course, education. So those state initiatives resulted in a couple of things in the last few years. One was the executive order by the governor, which resulted in a cross-agency directive to implement pollinator protections, which is still going on, and the Lawns to Legumes program for communities and for individuals to transform turf and unused land into habitat. In Pollinator Friendly Alliance, our main initiatives include education, advocacy, and installing pollinator habitat. So this slide shows a group of volunteers laying an establishing blanket after sod cutting the turf out, which was replaced then with a pollinator lawn in Stillwater, Minnesota, on an unused city lot where the city's water tank lies. And this is an established pollinator lawn. You notice the grasses are especially helpful here for butterflies who often find refuge from predators and weather at the base of the grasses. Many of you may have noticed when you walk through a prairie or a field that the butterflies will sort of flicker up from the base of the grasses. So that's important for our butterflies. This is a picture of a local and county collaboration. So it's very important to develop partnerships because we can get a lot more done when we work together. Here are some volunteers working on installing or planting rather some native plant species in an enhancement at Pine Point Park. It's a 14-acre enhancement of a protected prairie area. So this is a before picture of a prairie that volunteers, well, wait, here it is. Here's the before. Sorry about that. That's the before of an unused piece of land in Stillwater. The city's water tank is underneath that acre, so they can't really do anything with it. So the volunteers took over, and here's the prairie that resulted. Another way to encourage policies on a local, county, and state level are pollinator protection resolutions. This is an example of a resolution. In general, what they do is promote healthy environments, ask for the cease of use of systemic insecticides, do an inventory of pesticides being used, plant pollinator habitat, encourage public education and awareness, and require that a coordinator be assigned to oversee the work. Another way that policies can help with pollinator conservation is through an integrated pest management plan. And this approach, just a moment, I'm sorry, I lost my place here, is an important action for both community and county land managers. It encourages best management practices, such as using the least toxic option first and pesticides as the last option, by correcting conditions that lead to pest problems and using pesticides only when necessary. IPM provides more effective control and conservation of beneficial insects, including bees and insect predators and butterflies. So this is an example of a IPM program that Irvine, California is using. You can see their strategy on the left and their corresponding reduction of pesticide use on the right. So they went down almost to 0 in 4 years with their IPM program. This is an example of Washington County's IPM program. And Washington County is a model for other communities and counties in the work that they do a really great job. So on the left are their strategies, and on the right is a snapshot of just one of the plant species in their IPM program. So they list out each method used for that specific plant, which happens to be all of our least favorite plant, buckthorn. And they use, as you can see, burning, oat cover crops, mowing, and goats. And they only treat stumps. So no pesticide use there. This is the solarization method. See if the little video will play. So the black plastic was laid during the hottest months of summer, and it actually cooks the vegetation underneath, and then you remove it. So that area is along a trail in Stillwater, Minnesota, and we were able to plant a prairie without using any pesticides in that situation. Oops. So backyards are also a very important place for habitat. We can transform our backyards into many biodiverse plant and animal communities and corridors for habitat. Also, as Angie spoke about the deep root systems, these shrubs and trees and native plants have a lot more substantial and longer root system, which filters water. So untidy yards are great for habitat, mulch piles, providing water and places for nesting. Now I'm just going to show you a few examples of some habitat. My favorite part, here's one in Egan in a backyard by Minnesota Native Landscapes. Here's another one in St. Anthony, backyard habitat. And this one is in Scandia. This is in Duluth, and this is a curbside strip. We'll call it an insectary strip because it's great for beneficial insects too. And then this is a buffer strip along a roadside, which you can't really see the road, but it's on the right. So I think I'm pretty close to the end here. I encourage you to learn more, protect, and unite. We all can do a lot to help our pollinators. A few things include ceasing pesticide use, planting habitat, tolerate some weeds like dandelions, accept some plant damage, replace that turf, make your workplace, your school, or your neighborhood pollinator friendly. Ask your city or county to pass a pollinator resolution. Ask your legislators to support strong pollinator protections, and educate yourself and others. So here's just a few backyard guides. If you have a cell phone, you can take a little snapshot of those links. And here's a few great plant lists. And that's all I got.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laurie. Are there any immediate questions that came in? I didn't see any in the chat related to pollinators. If not, I will, if you want to stop sharing your screen, I'll turn things over to Greg Seitz to take us on a little bit of a virtual safari through the St. Croix watershed and learn about the wildlife in the area.
Okay, great. Can you see my presentation? I hope
Yes.
so. All right, well, thanks. It's tough to follow Angie and Laurie. Those were great presentations. I think while they were both talking about getting your hands dirty and planting or working on policies, this should be the fun and recreational side of things, a little less difficult and a little more just appreciating what we have here. And like Angie said, we're going to call this a virtual wildlife safari. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the wildlife, the amazing diversity of wildlife that call this area home, and a tool that you can use to kind of help explore and learn more about the wildlife and contribute to science as well. Just okay, like I was saying, the St. Croix River and the nearly 8,000 square miles that drain into it in Minnesota and Wisconsin are home to just a really incredible amount of wildlife. There are rare and endangered species. There is just an incredible range of wildlife, and that includes reptiles. We see turtles up there. There's a map turtle, which gets that name from its shell, which resembles a topographic map. There is a, there is a prothonotary warbler, kind of a mouthful. It's one of my favorite birds because it lives right in the floodplain of the St. Croix River. It's a beautiful, bright yellow bird that happens to live in tree cavities and nest in tree cavities along the St. Croix. There's cardinal flower, which is the first time I ever saw cardinal flower. I paddled over in my kayak because I thought there was some garbage on the shore. And that's just because it's such a bright red that it's almost hard to believe it's natural. And it comes out in August and September. And that's actually, speaking of pollinators, a really interesting one because the ruby-throated hummingbirds that we all love so much, they feed on the cardinal flower and actually help pollinate it as well. And it's one of the great late season flowers that gives them some extra nectar and fuel for their journey south and their migration. River otters, you'll see down on the bottom left, another great creature that lives in the river. Not often seen. They're definitely around though, and they're cute and also really interesting animals that feed on fish. One thing I learned recently is that river otter babies don't know how to swim when they're born, and their parents have to teach them. Also great blue herons. There are a couple of rookeries. Great blue herons nest in treetops in huge colonies that are called rookeries, usually in the middle of a river on an island or something, and there are a couple great rookeries along the St. Croix. And then the last one you'll see here is a horned club-tailed dragonfly. That's a species of special concern. There are, I'd say right now especially, there are just swarms of dragonflies on the river. You've probably seen them. And they are definitely one of the more fascinating creatures that call the river home. I really advocate and encourage everybody to get to learn wildlife. And it's a lifelong pursuit. I've only really been attempting the last few years myself. I've always loved the scenery of the St. Croix River, and I've gone to it often for that reason, to enjoy just the pure natural beauty. But when you start to learn some of the birds and insects and flowers and everything, it can just really deepen that connection and that relationship with the river. And it's fun, of course, too, just to be able to identify things and learn where to find things and that sort of thing. Here's a magnolia warbler. This one was photographed. I was at a bird banding event along the Willow River over in Hudson in the spring, a couple years ago. And that's where they set up nets in the woods that catch the birds, and then they take them back and have them put a band on them, record that band number, so that bird can be, if it's recaptured. That's a magnolia warbler, just an absolutely beautiful little bird. And then the more you learn about these species, the more you discover how they all have very specific needs for where they can live and how they can survive. They aren't here by accident, but rather they just find what they need along the St. Croix. And here's some examples of that. So the eastern meadowlark, you'll see there, it depends, it has very strict habitat needs. It needs wide open grasslands primarily. Pastures also will work, but we're seeing fewer kind of pasture land areas and more corn and soybeans, and so we're losing a lot of that habitat. But also, of course, they just love prairie. This one happened to be photographed down at Belwyn in Afton, where they have bison on their prairie, and it's one of the great places to see meadowlarks, and I think the bison have something to do with that too. They just make for a very natural prairie habitat. The Carner blue butterfly, somebody, either Laurie or Angie mentioned that earlier, a federally endangered butterfly that lives in the area. It has very strict food needs. Its caterpillars only will eat lupin and feed on that. So if you don't have lupin, you're not going to have Carner blue butterflies. Muscillate clubtail is a dragonfly that particularly needs really clean, fast-moving, clear water. As you may know, dragonflies spend much of their lives underwater, and they only emerge into their flying form for their final adult stage. And so these skillet clubtails, and many clubtail and other dragonflies really need clean water to survive their adolescence. You can see a horned grebe. That's a bird, like many, that is got a kind of dire forecast, because as the climate changes, their summer breeding habitat is expected to disappear, which is up in Canada. And we see them coming up the St. Croix during migration periods. And if their summer habitat goes away, there'll be nowhere for them to be headed. So they need the climate conditions as they are now. Another one, non-native and invasive species can disrupt ecosystems. So a plant like ash trees, here's a white ash, can be decimated by the emerald ash borer. So they really need a specific set of sort of predators and competitors to make the whole ecosystem work. And then many of the mussels, the amazing mussels that live in the St. Croix River, have very close relationships with fish species, because for mussels to reproduce, they have to have a specific type of fish around to help them with that reproduction. And in this example, the winged maple leaf, which is a federally endangered species, requires catfish to be present in order for it to successfully reproduce and create new generations. So like I said, just the more you learn about all these different creatures, the more you see how they really, it's a very complicated and complex connections between them, and they really need specific things to survive. And then another really exciting thing about, like I said, this almost 8,000 square miles that drain into the St. Croix is that it's sort of where the east meets the west. The eastern hardwood deciduous forest meets the western kind of prairie, and as well as a little bit of the north. And so here we have up north a common loon. That one was up by Moose Lake. We have a prairie skink, which is a western prairie species. It looks like a snake with legs. That happens to be at my house. We find them around our house a lot. And they're very cool little creatures. But like I said, a real kind of western prairie species. And then a wood anemone, a very beautiful little spring ephemeral flower that grows in those hardwood eastern forests. So it makes it really exciting to look around here, because you can find species that really live in all these kind of huge, these different areas, like, eastern forests versus western prairie. They come together right here to make it very exciting. You never know what you'll see. And another great thing about the St. Croix Valley is that we just have a lot of parks and nature preserves and other protected lands, including the river, of course. And that is both great habitat for all these creatures, and it's also great places to go and hike and paddle and boat, or however you wish to get out there and to look for these things. So here at William O'Brien State Park, a very popular park in Marine on St. Croix, here we have a cool plant, butterfly weed, with 2 species of butterflies on it, a great spangled fritillary and a monarch, both on that butterfly weed, feasting away. Over at Standing Cedars, a very cool privately organized nature preserve, but with areas open to the public, called Standing Cedars, Community Land Conservancy by Osceola. There you see some really cool prairie smoke, a flower that looks like Dr. Seuss invented it or something like that. And then on the bottom, right over the river, this photo was taken from a boat of an osprey, a really cool fish-eating predatory bird that you'll often see along the St. Croix. And so again, we have these protected areas. They protect that habitat, the fragile sort of habitat that a lot of these animals need and plants. And we also have, and also just great places to go have fun, especially in this time when we're all looking for something fun to do outdoors. We have tremendous opportunities for that. Now, I've learned almost everything I know that I just shared with you by using a website and an app called iNaturalist. It was developed by the California Academy of Sciences and National Geographic. And it allows you to explore a region and see what lives there, see what other people have seen, and to share your own observations. This shows you the map on the right side here, shows you the St. Croix River watershed and all the observations of wildlife that have been made there. And you can just click through that map and explore where things are seen, when they're seen, and really start to get a sense of the wildlife that call this place home. And then you can add your own observations. If you create an account, anybody can do that. You can use your Google or Facebook account. And then you can start creating your own list of creatures and plants and animals that you see. Here I've got the prothonotary warbler again. A really great thing about iNaturalist is that they have introduced a artificial intelligence or computer visioning sort of system, but basically it will give you suggestions for what is in your photo, and it can be tremendously useful for learning how to identify different plants and animals. It basically has this huge database of everybody's observations of plants and animals, and it compares your photo to all those other observations and what's found nearby and when, you know, at this time of year, and it will give you suggestions. And it's really surprisingly accurate. It's not always accurate, but it's surprisingly effective. So to create an observation, you identify the species. You generally, it'll pull the day and time right from your camera. And then you just say where you saw it, and you just have to click on a map to show where you saw this thing, and then you submit the observation. And then it has what's kind of like a peer review process where then other users will review your observation and agree or disagree with your identification. And so it gives you a little more confidence in what you've identified. I'm going through this really fast, I realize, but I'm going to have some resources at the end to help you if you're interested in trying this. And then this is just a few of my most recent observations. You'll get a nice list of all of your observations on iNaturalist. It shows a map of where they were. You can search these and export the data in all kinds of ways. So you can say, I just want to see the plants or the flowers or the birds or the dragonflies that I've seen, and sort things and have a lot of fun doing that and kind of creating your own personal list of everything you've seen. And then you can explore other observations by other people. You can do this without an iNaturalist account or anything like that. And one cool thing is, I think in sort of naturalist work, often we talk about counties, what kind of creatures are found in a county or in a state. What I like about iNaturalist is you can explore by watershed. That's drawn me to it. So again, to be able to look at the entire St. Croix River watershed, which spans 2 states and 11 or 12 counties, and see what makes this place home, what calls this place home, is really fun. So here is just a grid again of recent observations. There are more than 20,000 observations in the St. Croix River watershed. I believe right now more than 2,000 people have contributed, and about 2,000 species have been shared. So it really shows a lot of the diversity. I mean, I think 2,000 different types of life in this area is just kind of mind-blowing and really fun to explore. Let's say you want to check out one of these observations. You see an interesting creature like this bird right in the middle. What is that? Click on it. Oh, it's a red-shouldered hawk. That was me who guessed that one earlier when Angie showed it. This is a vulnerable species. You can see right next to the name, the little VU. It'll tell you if it's endangered or threatened or vulnerable. and it'll again show you where and when. And so just really fun to click around and see what people have seen. And I just do that. I thought I'd kind of close here by just going through a few more interesting observations that you can find in the watershed, the St. Croix River watershed on iNaturalist. I don't know if anybody knew this, but there is a species of dragonfly actually named after the St. Croix River. It was first found here in about 1991. It's called the St. Croix snaketail. And this photo is a St. Croix snaketail that was just observed in the last week or two. This is the time to go looking for them. This is the time when they emerge from their watery homes and turn into flying adults. This one is perched on a flower and devouring some other form of insect, some other type of insect. One interesting thing about the St. Croix snaketail too is that since it was first found here, it has also been found in Virginia, of all places, the state of Virginia. And what that really says is that this dragonfly was probably once more widespread. It probably once lived all over at least the eastern half of the country. And perhaps with all the pollution and things that have happened in the past couple hundred years, the beautiful protected St. Croix River is one of the few places it has managed to survive. And so it bears that name. It's a very cool creature. And like I say, it's out there flying around right now, one of the few places left where that still happens. I don't know if you've ever been on a snipe hunt or told you were being sent on a snipe hunt. I don't recommend hunting snipe, but they are real animals, real birds. This is a Wilson's snipe, photographed right at the mouth of the Apple River one spring during migration. A cool wading bird that jabs that long beak down into the mud in the bottom to grab insects and worms and other food hiding down there. Here's another. This one doesn't look like a whole lot, I'll give you that. It's called kittentails though, and it's a rare endangered plant that is, the St. Croix watershed is one of the few places where it's really found. It's really only found around here and a little bit elsewhere in Wisconsin and Minnesota, maybe Illinois. But really, this is one that plant experts would say is sort of an iconic species of the St. Croix. It really loves kind of dry prairies on the bluffs. Again, just an interesting plant, rare plant, with many observations on iNaturalist. I don't know if you knew that there were cactus that grow in these parts. This isn't exactly the desert, but for one place at Interstate Park in Wisconsin, there is some very interesting habitat called bedrock glades. So it's these dry, sunny places with that hard basalt bedrock we find up in the dells. And there's a plant called brittle prickly pear cactus that grows there. And I'll just say that when I knelt down to take this photo, I knelt on another cactus, and those spines are sharp in your knee. So watch out for that. Another interesting one, it's hard, this is a flower called fame flower. It's hard to get a picture of it blooming because it only blooms one day a year. And again, this is found up in Interstate Park is one of the hot spots for it. A very cool flower that you have to have really good timing to see. And I think this is my last observation because this was about an hour ago at my house. I had to add this one. It was hanging out on my porch underneath an eave. It's a Cecropia moth. I have to say, I think one of the most beautiful animals I've seen. Absolutely stunning, and it was just taking a little rest by hanging on to our porch. And again, that was right around lunchtime. I saw that today, and I thought I better show that one. And then the last thing I'll mention is that another fun way to use iNaturalist is sort of projects, they call them. This one is a BioBlitz that the Minnesota DNR is setting up. It just started today and runs for the next 2 weeks, and it's a way to, down in Bayport at the St. Croix Savannah Scientific and Natural Area, the DNR is organizing this BioBlitz where you can go to this really cool SNA, has great views of the river and really cool habitat, and just share all your observations that you find there. And it's a way to sort of learn more about what's happening at this cool SNA in Bayport, right along the river. We can maybe have, if anybody has questions, I'm happy to hear them. was going to say, or for anybody else. I know we're running short on time.
That was really great, Greg.
Okay, I'm just going to click forward one more, and that's just the websites and the other info. And I'd like to say I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Yeah. If anybody has questions that you wanted to ask Greg, Laurie, or I, and didn't have a chance to ask during the presentations, you can either type them in the chat box right now or turn on your mics and we can have a little bit of an interactive conversation now that the presentations are done. Greg, I do see some questions coming in. What plants do you have that attract wildlife? Like, I think, what do you have that's at your house that was bringing in the skink and the Cecropia moth?
Yeah, I can't speak about those two. I think while I was talking about one of these, I had a hummingbird buzz by my window, and that's been one. There happens to be an azalea bush right in front of my window that the hummingbirds love, and I get to see hummingbirds every day. I'm not even sure if azaleas are native. I don't think they are. It was planted by the previous homeowner. But that's been a real treat. I think this time of year, while that thing's blooming, the hummingbirds love it, and the bumblebees and other pollinators. As far as like the skink goes, I've never quite been able to figure that out. They're insect eaters. Maybe we just have a lot of bugs in our yard.
There was a question from Gina Bonsignor talking about what is St. Croix 360, and I can tell folks, but you can probably tell folks better.
You know what? You can probably tell them better because I just think about it too much. If you want to give it a shot.
So, I mean, my impression is that St. Croix 360 is a blog style website that shares information about the St. Croix River and the St. Croix Valley. So Greg is really good at both writing and sharing his own content, but also cross-sharing information from other organizations, and does a lot in partnership with the St. Croix River Association as well.
Yeah, that pretty much nails it. The slogan is River Stories to Inspire Stewardship. So I just really think my mission is to help inform and educate people who love the river and inspire folks to protect it and take care of it.
Yep. I see Laurie mentioned that the Cecropia moth's biggest host is the oak tree. You have oak trees at your house, maybe?
Thank you, Laurie. That explains it. We live in an oak forest. Yes, we have a lot of oak trees. So I did not know that. Great to know.
Yeah. There's a question. Do you have a favorite site for bird calling identification? I had some good recommendations I had in the longer version of my presentation, and I cut out. There's a really fun device called an identifier we used to use at one of the nature centers I worked at, where you put little cards in and you could hear what the sounds sounded like. But then there was also an online version where you could take a recording and then play it, and you could figure out what the bird was. And that, if you give me a moment, I'll maybe figure it out while somebody else answers a different question.
I think Audubon has an app that's supposed to help with identifying bird calls as well.
Merlin, right?
Yeah, I think there's an I don't use them, so I probably shouldn't speak to them. I know Merlin's for IDing, but I also think there might be the one that's more like a standalone, just for songs. But I will say that iNaturalist allows you to upload audio recordings as well as photos, and so if you upload an audio recording, people can help you identify it that way.
Okay, I just found the two that I had from my previous presentation, so I'm sharing them in the chat. One was called Bird Genie, and the other was, well, the identifier that I talked about before. That one is like an actual device you have to purchase to use, but the Bird Genie is one where you can, it's just an app that you can upload the sounds and it will tell you what they are.
I must say some of my favorite wildlife attractors are trees. For instance, the serviceberry tree has beautiful flowers in the spring that pollinators come to, and then in the fall, the cedar waxwing and other birds come to the berries. Mm-hmm. And the trees are huge host plants for a variety of birds and moths, like the Cecropia and the Polyphemus, and I mean, there's just so much life in trees. It blows my mind how many creatures and organisms can be living on one bur oak.
Yeah. Okay, well, I know that I am very inspired now to try to upload some of my nature observations onto iNaturalist. You know, I always take all of these great photos and I'm like, I want to share these with somebody who cares about this just as much as I do. And that sounds like the perfect group of people. Let's see, there is one last question maybe before we call off the meeting. Gina is asking, Laurie, can you talk about the importance of native species versus cultivars or natives not native to this area?
So some cultivars have been so genetically modified that they start to lose their ability to create pollen and nectar. So that's the biggest thing to look out for. And that's especially prominent in some of the daisies and coneflowers. That's the short answer.
Yeah, yep. Okay, like I said, this has been recorded. And so for any of you who joined late, do not fear. I will upload this recording and send out a link to everybody after the workshop. Greg and Laurie, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. And everybody else, thank you so much for joining us. We do have one last workshop in this series that will be happening next week, Wednesday, same time, 2 till 3 p.m. And we will have staff from the Minnesota and Wisconsin DNR talking specifically about the St. Croix Riverway and floodplain areas and what kinds of action you can take to protect property during high water times. So that should be a really good one as well. And without further ado, go on out there and enjoy the world. It looks like the sun literally just came out this instant, right at the end. So go on out there and enjoy some of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.